I always talk about storytelling in my videos, but so far I haven't really defined it. The Grimdark sponging paint style is a start. The more atmospheric look from the textured volumetric highlights already starts to paint more of a picture than the box standard edge highlighting. But on its own, that's just not enough for me, and I imagine if you're here, you probably feel the same way too. If that's the case, have no fear. My name's Colt, this is Gone Hollow Minis, and today we're taking a look at how to start telling your own stories through your mini painting and tabletop wargaming. This captain already has a bit of story to him. He's a model that I first painted about a year ago, and he was one of my first footsteps into kit bashing. It was pretty much just a standard head swap, but it opened the door for a lot of the stuff that I do now. A while back I even started on giving him a bit of an upgrade, giving a few extra bits and repriming him. But at the time, I also kinda cheaped out and just planned on sticking him to a 3D base topper, and don't get me wrong, it looks nice, but I think I can do better. Especially since I want to start talking about more storytelling in my mini painting and really defining that, why don't we take the chance to give this captain here his own character? My process in coming up with characters always starts with a name. It's simple, easy, and not too hard to come up with as a starting point. If you need ideas for this, the Crusade section of the Blood Angels Codex has a whole list of names to choose from. I landed on the name Calisteel Dybok. The first name sounds suitably angelic, but clashes with the harsher syllables of the surname. Since Blood Angels are all about the struggle between nobility and savagery, I think that little bit of symbology fits in the name. And plus, if you're as big of a fan of vampire literature as I am, you probably know where that surname comes from. Now, I want to make a brief point about canon here. For a lot of these larger chapters like Blood Angels, GW kind of has characters covered. Every company has a captain, every captain has his own command staff, and pretty much everyone is already labeled. This has led a lot of new painters that I've seen to be kind of unsure about how to go about making their characters. A lot of them are too concerned with making correct paint schemes, and I just don't think that matters all that much. If you're new, or if that's something that you're worried about, don't be. As much as Warhammer is about the lore and story, it's also about creativity. This is your army. Feel free to bring your own flair and character to it. Take my army, for instance. My favorite company of the Blood Angels is the 4th Company, sheerly because they're called the Knights of Baal and I like knights. The Warhammer canon says that Captain Rafen leads the 4th Company, and while he's a perfectly fine character and there's a whole trilogy of books about him, I kinda want to do my own thing. But let's put that aside for now, and let's get back to our miniature. I want my captain, Captain Dybok, to be a swordsman. Swords are a pretty iconic Blood Angels weapon, and I like swords anyway, so it's a pretty natural fit. But first, our captain needs an adversary, and what better adversary for a Blood Angel than a Night Lord? They kind of show two sides of the same vampire coin. The Blood Angels are the nobility, while the Night Lords are the sheer depraved savagery. But now we've got an idea of the type of project we're looking at. I want to make my own captain, not recreate a canon one, and I want his mini to tell a story. But how am I going to do that? Luckily, captains come on pretty chunky 40mm bases. That, plus the fact that this guy's tactical rock keeps him well above the base itself, gives me a lot of room to work with. I already reposed this captain into a generally sword-forward position when I last painted him, so I think I'm going to keep that. This is the stock sword arm from the captain kit, it's just rotated a little bit more to make the pose aggressive, and the blade is swapped out with one from the Blood Angels upgrade sprue. With our captain situated, now for our adversary. There's pretty much no miniature that's better suited to be a Night Lord than a Raptor, or a Warp Talon. I really don't understand the difference. But luckily I had an extra one knocking around my bit bin, so I went ahead and built him up using a pair of lightning claws. I also used some 3D printed pauldrons to give him some more identifiably Night Lordy details. Now you're probably noticing that I left off one very important part of this Night Lord, his head. And that's because, while Stoic Marines are great, I want my pose to have a little bit more action, a little bit more blood, and a little bit more gore. My plans for this poor edgelord's head won't come to fruition until a bit later, but I did take the chance to go ahead and sculpt a bit of a stump into the neck socket. This was done with just a bit of green stuff, mushed into a cylinder, stuck into the neck, and then given some grisly details with a stylus. I'm not too fussed about keeping it anatomically accurate, since most of this will be, covered later. It's just to make sure there's something more to the stump than smooth. As you can probably tell, I did this a little bit later in the process, purely because I forgot. I figured I'd go ahead and mention it here because the order really doesn't matter and it'd probably be easier to do this earlier anyway. From here, I was able to take my mostly assembled Warp Talon and get him onto his base. All I had to do was trim away some of the details on the base topper, as well as some of the bits cluttering the Warp Talon's actual tactical rock. Then I was able to drill a hole into the bottom of the Warp Talon wide enough for a short piece of brass rod. Once inserted into a corresponding hole in the base, this should be strong enough to hold our Warp Talon in place without snapping off. I also went ahead and figured out where the captain would sit and dropped a pin there as well. From there, I took a moment to use some texture paint to cover up some of the base details I had removed earlier, throwing a couple of skulls and bits of rubble to remind everyone that it's Warhammer, and the base is finished. Now, getting stuck into the painting, we're going to start off with a black base coat. Feel free to use whatever you have on hand and are comfortable with. I just used a quick black rattle can. Let's go ahead and tackle this base first. Since most of this is either going to be boring stone or drab dirt, we're going to work in some more color variation with our base coats. On the stone, for instance, I'm going to pick out some parts in Vallejo Whole Red, while other parts get picked out in Army Painter Brigandine Brown. While I do this, I'm trying my best to stay away from the Night Lord. It's not the end of the world if he catches some stray pigment, but I do want to keep that to a minimum. Now we're going to start building up our stony colors. We're going to hit everything with a dry brush of Army Painter Deep Gray. This makes our blotchy brown and red bricks look more like stone, but leaves a bit of our color variation in the recesses. After that, to add a bit of texture, we're going to sponge on a lighter gray. Here I used a mix of Vallejo Sky Gray darkened with a tiny bit of Army Painter Deep Gray. For one last stony highlight, I used a bit of Army Painter Brain Matter Beige. With a very light dry brush, I used this to catch all the most raised edges and corners to really define the myriad shapes of the rubble. Now, to be entirely honest, I usually get lazy with my dirt. I don't think it's weird to say that painting dirt is boring, and to be honest, it's probably the last thing anyone is going to be looking at on our miniature anyway. So for this captain, I just picked out the dirt with Army Painter Brigandine Brown and gave it a few careful layers of dry brushed browns, ochres, and tans. Now for a little bit more work picking out the details like the skulls. And once those are painted up, our base is pretty much good to go. Now that our base is finished, let's go ahead and talk paint style for our characters. The captain, the focal point of the mini, needs to fit in with the rest of my Grimdark sponged Blood Angels. This recipe is designed to emulate the grit, grime, and corrosion that would build up on a Space Marine's armor in the middle of a campaign. These Marines have been in the thick of noble combat for some time, and haven't gotten a chance to clean their armor yet. But noble combat isn't really the MO of the Night Lords. They're more the strike from the shadows, sneaky types. So we're going to use this difference to really highlight the contrast between our two characters, both in character and paint style. I've already dabbled a little bit with painting Night Lords, and this whole idea of contrast already came up then too. My angels were gritty, grimy, and dirty, so I thought that painting my Chaos Marines with a clean, metallic, almost candy-coated surface finish would be an interesting contrast. I came across a pretty interesting way of doing this, using a mix of metallic base coats and transparent paints to make an almost hot rod-like feel. This is a really interesting technique, and I definitely want to dive deeper into it in the future, but for now, let's go ahead and stick to just painting this one Night Lord. From our black base coat, we're going to start with some metallics. The first thing we're going to hit our Marine with is a dry brush of Vallejo Metal Colors Steel. This is a nice dark silver color that will be a great base for our Marine. Next, to really darken our recesses, I'm going to use a quick black wash. This will help keep our recesses dark, since painting like this doesn't leave all too much room for tinkering after our midnight blue is applied. Once that's done, we're going to take care of our highlights. Since there's going to be another layer of transparent blue over the top of this, I want these highlights to be pretty noticeable. To do that, I'm jumping up to Vallejo Metal Color Aluminum. This is a really bright, almost white metallic that will really help our highlights come through in our next layers. Okay, now that we've got our metallic base coat covered, this is where some of the more technical stuff comes in. The secret to this technique is using a fairly transparent paint over the top of our metallics to tint them into the color we want. The reason that we don't just use a blue metallic here is that doing it this way will help to build up depth on our miniature, which is something that I think is really important for the whole in midnight clad vibe. The paint I'm using for this is just Vallejo Air Color Blue. This is a super transparent paint that acts almost like a contrast paint, but really any deep blue contrast or speed paint would work just fine too. Also, since we're doing this on a Chaos Space Marine, make sure to be careful around the trim. There will inevitably be mistakes, so don't stress too much, just try to keep them to a minimum. Next up, we're going to shade the recesses with our purple shade. Not only is this going to darken our recesses, the purple tone will also work well with our blue layer to make a really neat transition between the two colors. Now just to pick out the details. Since this is a Night Lord, most of that is just gold trim, and all of that I did with just Sicker X Bronze and Army Painter Dark Skin Tone. The end result is a surprisingly clean Night Lord. This is the kind of thing that I picture when I hear in midnight clad. Not just blue power armor, but a deep, kind of mesmerizing armor that would blend into the night sky. This is a really neat technique that I want to get into more detail with, but for now I think we'll leave it here. Just remember, if you do try this on your own Night Lords, remember to attach the head first. Now to paint Captain Divok. He's going to more or less follow the exact process that I already outlined in my Battle Ready Red video, which you can find here. So instead of rehashing that, I'm going to take the chance to explain why storytelling on the tabletop is so important to me. For those that don't know, I went to school for creative writing, and I do quite a bit of it when I'm not working or recording, but don't worry, I'll spare you all the rhetorical analysis and mushy critic stuff. You know. For now. But that background and those interests really do color how I look at my games of Warhammer. There's so much potential in these little pieces of plastic to make something that we really connect with. Over the hours and hours we spend at the gaming table, each of our little plastic spacemen starts to take a life of their own. Every successful save is a mortal wound barely dodged, every unexpected 6 is a turn of the fate that could lead to your character's against the odds victory. These collected stories are a huge reason that we play war games, and connecting them to a miniature that feels like they've been through all of it makes that effect even more impactful. And let's not forget the world building that's already been done for us. Warhammer is one of the most complicated pieces of sci-fi writing, for better or for worse, and so much of our hobby pushes us to totally immerse ourselves in it. In a way, we're lucky that in the process of engaging with this universe, Warhammer hands us the opportunity to carve out our very own corner of it, to take these pieces of plastic and mold them into stories that mean something to us, and reflect who we are as both players and painters. But okay, enough of that mushy stuff. This is Grimdark after all. No room for sentimentality, only war. A while back, I picked up this bottle of cheap UV resin from a hobby store. I got it to add puddles to some of my swampy Grimdark bases, but it can be used for so much more. The goal for this project is to show the captain mid-swing, lopping off the trader's noggin with one fell stroke. To achieve that in the most over-the-top Warhammer way, I'm going to be using the UV resin to make a huge Akira Kurosawa-looking blood splatter. I'm going to start here with the neck, the lower part of this splatter. It should more or less be the easiest. I'm going to take a piece of paperclip here to act like an armature to help shape how our splatter is going to look. Once that's done, I'm going to take the UV resin and start dripping it down the paperclip. I have a bit of working time with this, since it won't fully cure until I hit it with a UV flashlight, so I can use another paperclip to manipulate it a little bit to get it just how I want it. I can also use the UV flashlight strategically here, hitting it right as it's coming out of the bottle to get these gross little droplets. Once that's all where I want it to be, I hit it with the UV flashlight a little bit longer to harden everything in place. Now this can take a couple applications, but that's okay. We don't want any one of our globs being too thick, or else the UV flashlight might have a hard time curing it all the way through. Once the bottom was done, I moved on to the top. This one was pretty much the same, just with drips going a different direction. Once I got it looking how I wanted it, it was time to make it look like actual blood. This was done, of course, with the liberal application of Blood for the Blood God, applied to all the nooks and crannies to make sure it was all red all the way through. Once that was done, it was looking a little bit flat for my liking, so I took some Murder Scene speed paint, thinned it down a little bit, and used this as a wash for some of the thicker parts to add a little bit of shading while keeping everything nice and transparent. Once that was done, I stuck on the poor Night Lord's head, blended it in with a little bit more Blood for the Blood God, gave the base rim a nice quick coat of black, and was left with this. When we're painting an entire army, it's easy to get caught up in the end result. We want our army to look good, but we also want it to be finished in a timely manner. I definitely understand the rush of painting up battle line units, but every now and then it's nice to take a break and really stretch ourselves with the characters that will be leading our army. Every game is a story, and every miniature is a character in its own right, so why not give them the attention they deserve? We may be the ones painting our miniatures, sure, but in the end it's these little pieces of plastic that are telling our stories on the battlefield. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope this video gave you some ideas on how to tell your own stories with your miniatures, or at the very least that one of these techniques was worth taking home. Whichever the case, feel free to drop a like and a comment. I love hearing what y'all have to say and I'll be engaging with as many as I can. And while you're down there, if you're not already, go ahead and subscribe. It'll help you keep in touch with all the stories that Gone Hollow Minis has to offer. But until the next time, friend, be safe, be kind, and don't you dare go hollow.